I'm going to talk about existential threats. Not fun. Now, the good news is that an existential threat is an extremely rare event in the annals of human history. Think about it. How many countries in history have actually faced a threat to their very survival? Dad, my father here, fought in World War II. He fought from the coast of Normandy all the way through Germany. And Dad, correct me if I'm wrong. I know you will. Well, he deserves that. You did not fight to destroy the German people. You didn't even just fight to destroy Germany. Well, maybe you did. You fought to destroy the heinous Nazi government, and other people, other boys of your school, your generation, fought to defeat the imperial government of Japan, but not to destroy Japan as a state, not to annihilate the Japanese people. A true existential threat is very, very rare in human history. This country, to the best of my knowledge, probably never faced a real existential threat. Think about it. The War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, what is the worst thing that would have happened? That those 13 states would have reverted to colonies and would have remained part of the British Empire for a certain period of time. You'd probably like that, Colonel Kemp. They would have evolved into a Commonwealth kind of country like Canada or New Zealand. We'd have some woman on our coinage today. But the American people, the United people, would not have ceased to exist. America, one could strongly argue, has never, ever faced a true existential threat. The state of Israel, on a daily basis, faces multiple existential threats. Not one, not two. The good news is they've only given me 20 minutes to talk about this. Many existential threats. And I could begin with the most obvious existential we face, the most palpable, the daily existential threat we face is from terror, from the terrorists of Hamas and Hezbollah. You know, once upon a time in Israel's history, Israeli military security experts used to think of terror as sort of a nuisance. Yes, Israelis were killed every year, even during that halcyon period between 1957 and 1967, where we weren't openly at war. Hundreds of Israelis were killed by terrorist attacks, but it was considered somehow acceptable, somehow tolerable terror was. It was a gadfly. Then came September of 2000, what the Palestinians call their second intifada. The suicide bombers who struck at our buses, at our restaurants, at our movie houses. We couldn't go outside. We couldn't go to theaters. Sally will tell you that her sister, a Jewish day school teacher from New Haven, Connecticut, a friend of the Lieberman family who came to Israel on a Melton scholarship to Hebrew University, boarded a number 9 bus in Rehavia and never arrived, a victim of a suicide bomber. And the tourism fled, and the foreign investment dried up, and suicide bombing was killing us as a nation. And the very generals of the Israeli army came to the government at the time and says there's no answer. Never before in history has a conventional army operating at the behest of a democratic government ever defeated terror. It was killing us. And then on top of the suicide bomber came the rockets, the Katyusha rockets from Lebanon, the Qassam rockets from Gaza. And though these were mid-20th century military technologies, we could not come up with a 21st century response to them. And as their range expanded from Sderot onward to Ashdod, Ashkelon, Beersheba in the south, and from Kiryat Shmona down to Haifa and then Hadera in the north, widening radii of ranges, most of sovereign Israel came under fire from these rockets. And should the rockets ever find their way into the West Bank, God help us, because then all of our major population centers and industrial centers would become literally uninhabitable. So the rockets, too, from terror, pose existential threats, a threat to the very survival of the Jewish state. And then, of course, is the primary backer of Hamas and Hezbollah today, the Islamic Republic of Iran. A republic, as you heard from Senator Lieberman, is rapidly seeking nuclear weapons and has declared its objective of wiping Israel off the map. They declare it so often now, it's so frequently it doesn't even get reported in the press anymore. That's why you need organizations like Camera to call attention to it. And Iran with a nuclear weapon poses not one, not two, but several existential threats to the state of Israel. The most obvious threat, that once those mullahs get a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon, they will press a button, and the state of Israel, which is, alas, about the state of the size of New Jersey, will simply cease to exist. And whether or not Israel has a second strike capability may or may not be relevant, because according to Israeli security analysts, many of them believe that the regime in Tehran is willing to give up 1/2 of its population to see Israel destroyed. How do you deter a nation like that? But the existential threat posed by a nuclear-armed Iran, the fact that that missile might strike Israel, is only the beginning of the existential threat. Once Iran gets nuclear capabilities, it can pass on those potentials to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to other terrorist organizations. And though the Israeli army does a courageous job of daily guarding our borders, no border is impermeable. No border. And those weapons could find their way into our cities and pose that type of existential threats. And once Iran gets a bomb, our ability to respond to terror, to respond to Katyusha strikes or Qassam strikes, is also limited. Think of a situation in which someone fires a rocket into Israel. Israel wants to respond to that rocket fire. And once we do, Iran goes on nuclear alert. Israel must go on some type of national alert. And once again, the tourists flee, and the foreign investment dries up, and the Iranians can kill us economically without firing a single shot. And then finally, if all of that is not sufficiently nightmarish, once Iran gets a bomb, then no less than 13 of our neighbors have declared their intention to acquire nuclear potential as well. So Israel will rapidly find itself in a nuclear neighborhood of the Middle East, which is profoundly unstable and volatile, and that will present an existential threat. Israel faces an existential threat from its international delegitimization, the delegitimization of the very idea of a Jewish state. It feels literally like yesterday. I was a young student covering the UN from a college newspaper, 1975, and I listened as the UN General Assembly passed a resolution equating Zionism with racism. And I thought that would be the end of it. I thought this was a one-off, an aberration. And later the UN would rescind that resolution, but I was wrong then, and I was wrong to think that any abrogation of that resolution would somehow end the systematic, relentless delegitimization of the Jewish state. It begins with delegitimization of the very idea of a Jewish state, even the idea of a Jewish people, that the Jewish people are somehow an imagined people in history with no real claim to the land. There never really was a temple atop that Temple Mount. There never was an ancient Judea. The Jews of today are descended from some later medieval people in Central Europe who disappeared, or Eastern Europe who disappeared. But it extends to the vitiation of the Zionist narrative. It's no longer about the return of an exiled people after 2,000 years, a people who have survived countless expulsions and inquisitions, who have endured throughout the greatest mass murder in human history to come back to their ancestral biblical homeland and create a thriving democratic state. It's no longer about that. It's about colonialism, racism, and imperialism. They've deprived us of our narrative. And it has then morphed into academic boycotts in Britain and in elsewhere. And we see it in the press, which during this recent Gaza operation, and I saw it firsthand, denied Israel the most fundamental right of all, and that is the right to defend itself. The delegitimization of Israel spreads into Israel itself through the school systems, through the media. A recent poll taken in the state of Israel showed that well over 60% of Israelis believe that they were guilty for the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. The Palestinian narrative has bled into the Israeli national consciousness, and that is an existential threat. It's an existential threat, again, on multiple levels. Because once Israel is denied its legitimacy as a sovereign state, once the Jewish people are even denied their legitimacy as an existing people, then that can lead to legislation in the United Nations, sanctions against Israel. And we know historically Israel has a difficult time surviving sanctions.